In 1986, two people walked into a police station in Los Angeles and named the murderer. They were not witnesses, they had not seen anything. They were the parents of the woman who had been killed 3 days earlier, and what they had was something less dramatic and, as it turned out, entirely correct. Their daughter had told them in the weeks before she died that a woman had come to her workplace and confronted her. She had described the woman, she had given her name. The parents passed all of it to the detectives handling the case. Nothing happened, not that week, not that year, not for 23 years. The woman they named was arrested in 2009 and convicted in 2012 of first-degree murder. By then, both of the victims' parents had spent more than 2 decades being told, in various polite forms, that they were grieving people with a theory. What makes this case worth the next 40 minutes is not that the police got it wrong. Investigations get things wrong, that is why cold case units exist. It is that the answer was in the file the entire time, written down correctly by people who had brought it in voluntarily, and that the specific reason nobody looked at it was the identity of the person it pointed to. She was a police officer. She worked for the department investigating the murder. This is the story of what that costs. Start with the 24th of February, 1986. Sherry Ray Rasmussen was 29 years old and had been married for 3 months. She was the director of critical care nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center in Los Angeles, a serious position for someone of that age, reached by someone who had qualified early and moved fast. Colleagues described her as exacting and warm in roughly equal measure, which is a good combination in intensive care and an unusual one anywhere. She lived with her husband, John Rutan, in a townhouse condominium in Van Nuys. They had married the previous November. That day she stayed home from work. She had hurt her back and had told her husband that morning she would rest. Rutan came home in the evening and found the front door open and his wife dead in the living room. The scene was, in the language of the reports, chaotic. There had been a violent struggle, furniture displaced, the room disturbed over a considerable area. She had been shot 3 times in the chest. There was a bite mark on her left forearm. Her car was gone. Her BMW was later found abandoned some distance away. And by the door stacked was stereo equipment. That stack is the hinge of everything that follows, so it is worth pausing on. Video and audio components gathered together near the exit, as though someone had been in the process of removing them and had been interrupted. There had been 2 burglaries in the immediate neighborhood in the preceding period, both attributed to a pair of men. So the detectives who attended formed a theory, and the theory was straightforward. 2 burglars had entered a condominium they believed to be empty. The occupant had been home, there had been a confrontation and she had been killed. They had taken the car and abandoned it. Everything at the scene could be read to fit that. The disorder was a struggle with intruders. The stereo was the property they had come for. The missing car was their escape. The case was worked as a burglary homicide. There is one more element of the scene worth setting out, because it was recorded at the time, and it took 23 years for anyone to weigh it properly. Sherry had been struck repeatedly before she was shot. The injuries were consistent with a prolonged physical fight rather than a brief confrontation, and there was evidence she had fought hard. The disorder in that room covered a wide area and objects had been used. That matters for a specific reason. A burglar surprised in a house has one overwhelming incentive, which is to leave. He has no reason to stay and fight a struggle across a living room. The behavior recorded in that room was not somebody trying to escape a situation. It was somebody who stayed. There was also a detail that should have been difficult to reconcile with the theory from the beginning. Sherry was shot 3 times in the chest at close range. 2 intruders disturbed mid-burglary, running, do not typically produce that pattern. It is a pattern associated with intent. None of this is hindsight, requiring modern forensic understanding. A homicide detective in 1986 knew perfectly well what a burglary interrupted looks like and what a personal killing looks like. The elements pointing away from burglary were visible on the first evening. Now, before this becomes a story about incompetence, It is worth being fair about what a detective standing in that room in 1986 actually had. The theory was not stupid. It explained the physical evidence economically, it matched a pattern of recent crimes in the same few streets, and it was the sort of thing that genuinely happens. A homicide detective who reached that conclusion on the evening of the 24th of February was doing ordinary competent work. The failure is not that they formed the theory, it is what happened when evidence arrived that did not fit it. Because a great deal did not fit it, and some of it was visible immediately. Consider the stereo equipment. It was stacked but not taken, and the burglars had supposedly fled, yet they had taken the time to gather components into a pile. More tellingly, the pile was of items that were awkward and heavy, and other things of obvious value in the house were untouched. Her jewelry was still there, her marriage certificate was on a table undisturbed. Consider the violence: 3 shots to the chest at close quarters, preceded by a struggle severe enough to wreck a room and a bite. Burglars who are surprised generally run. The pattern in that room was not flight, it was a fight that went on. Consider the bite mark itself. A bite in a struggle is not a burglary behavior, it is an intimate, close-quarters, furious act. And consider what was missing from the theory. The 2 burglars the pattern was based on were later arrested for other offenses, and there was nothing linking them to this address. None of that was hidden, it was all in the file from the first week. It is worth knowing more about who she was, because in cases like this, the victim tends to shrink to a set of circumstances, and she was a considerable person. Sherry Rasmussen had qualified as a nurse young and moved quickly. By 29, she was directing critical care nursing at a substantial Los Angeles hospital, running a unit, managing staff considerably older than herself, responsible for the sickest patients in the building. That is not a job that is handed to people, it is one that is earned by being visibly better at it than the alternatives. Colleagues who spoke about her afterwards described someone precise and demanding about clinical standards and unusually warm with families. Her father had been an engineer, and there is something of that in the accounts, a person who wanted things done properly and could explain why. She had met John Rutan through a mutual connection, and they had married in November 1985. 3 months later, she was dead in their living room. One detail from the accounts of that marriage matters for the case. Sherry had told her parents that the relationship with Rutan's previous girlfriend had not properly ended when the marriage began, that the woman had continued to be present in a way that troubled her, and that Rutan had not, in her view, handled it firmly enough. That is a domestic complaint of a kind that thousands of people make, and that almost never leads anywhere. It is only in retrospect that it becomes the outline of a motive. Then Sherry's parents arrived. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen were not people inclined to make trouble. They were a Midwestern family, Nels an engineer, and what they brought to the police was not a theory but a recollection. Their daughter had told them some weeks earlier that a woman had come to see her at the hospital, not a patient. The woman had been the girlfriend of John Rutan before Sherry, and she had not accepted the ending of that relationship. She had come to Sherry's workplace to confront her about the marriage. Sherry had described the encounter to her parents in terms that unsettled them, and she had told them the woman was a police officer. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. She worked for the Los Angeles Police Department. The account Sherry gave her parents of that visit is worth setting out as fully as the record allows, because it is the single most important document in the case, and it was treated as gossip. Sherry described a woman arriving at the hospital where she worked, not socially, not by arrangement, but turning up at her place of employment to speak to her about her marriage. The conversation was not friendly. By Sherry's account to her parents, it left her shaken enough that she raised it with them, and with at least one colleague. 2 things about that are significant and were significant at the time, if anyone had cared to look. The first is that going to somebody's workplace is an escalation. It is a deliberate act requiring planning, finding out where the person works, traveling there, and confronting them in a setting they cannot easily leave. It is not a chance encounter or an argument that got out of hand. The second is that Sherry told people she did not treat it as trivial. A woman who mentions an encounter to her parents and a colleague is a woman who found it frightening enough to want it on the record, and that instinct to tell somebody in case is one that investigators are trained to take seriously in every other context. There was also, by the family's account, more than one contact. This was not a single unpleasant conversation, but a pattern of a former partner refusing to accept that a relationship had ended. Put in modern language, what Sherry Rasmussen described to her parents in early 1986 was stalking behavior by an ex-partner of her husband, escalating to a confrontation at her workplace weeks before she was beaten and shot in her own home. In 1986, there was no offense of stalking in California. The state passed the first anti-stalking law in the United States in 1990, 4 years later, prompted by other cases. There was no framework that would have caused a detective to hear that account and recognize a pattern with a name. That is a genuine mitigation for the officers of 1986, and it is not a mitigation for what happened afterwards. The account did not become less relevant as the years passed. It became more so, and by 2005 it sat in the same file as a laboratory result, establishing that the killer had been a woman. The Rasmussens gave that information to the detectives. By their account, they gave it more than once, over a period of years, repeatedly in person and by telephone to a succession of officers. The response, as they described it afterwards, ranged from polite dismissal to something closer to irritation. The case was a burglary. That theory had been established. The suggestion that a serving officer of the investigating department had committed a murder was not a lead. It was, in the framing they encountered, an accusation from a family that could not accept a random tragedy. There is no evidence of a conspiracy here, and it is worth saying that plainly because the temptation to reach for one is strong. Nobody appears to have decided to protect Stephanie Lazarus. What happened is duller and in some ways worse. A theory had been adopted early. The lead pointed somewhere organizationally uncomfortable. And nobody with the authority to reopen the question wanted to be the person who made a formal allegation against a colleague on the strength of a bereaved family's account of a conversation. So it was not investigated, not blocked, just not done. There is something worth saying about the position the Rasmussens were in, because it is a specific and underdescribed kind of ordeal. A family that disagrees with a police conclusion has almost no leverage. They cannot compel an investigation. They cannot obtain the file. They cannot test evidence. What they can do is telephone, write letters, and ask for meetings, and every one of those actions is filtered through the assumption that grieving relatives commonly construct theories, because grieving relatives commonly do. That assumption is not unreasonable in general, and it was catastrophic in this instance. It meant the Rasmussens' information was assessed against a category, bereaved parents with a suspicion, rather than on what it actually was, which was a first-hand account their daughter had given them weeks before she died. The category was wrong and the information was right, and there was no mechanism by which the second fact could overcome the first. Nels Rasmussen kept his own file. He wrote things down, kept correspondence, and maintained a record of who he had spoken to and when. That is what people do when they are not believed. They build a paper trail against a day when somebody might read it. He was in his 50s when his daughter was killed, and in his late 70s when the verdict came. Who was Stephanie Lazarus? She had graduated from UCLA, where she had known John Rutan. They had been involved for a period on and off. She joined the LAPT in 1983, and by 1986 was a patrol officer with an unremarkable record. She would go on to a long and outwardly successful career, becoming a detective and eventually working in the art theft detail, a specialized and well-regarded unit. She married a fellow officer. She had a daughter. The art theft detail is worth a moment because of how it reframes the 23 years. It is a small, specialized assignment that departments give to detectives they rate. It requires patience, paperwork, knowledge of provenance and auction records, and the ability to work slowly through documents. It is a posting for someone methodical and trusted. So the picture is not of somebody hiding at the edges of the organization. She was promoted, specialized, and well-regarded inside the same department that held a file naming her for a quarter of a century. That is the detail that makes people assume a cover-up, and it is worth resisting the assumption. Nobody needed to protect her because nobody was looking. An unexamined lead does not become more visible because its subject is promoted, if anything the reverse. By the time she was arrested, she had served the department for 26 years. There is a detail from 1986 that belongs here, and it is the sort of thing that reads very differently in hindsight. 13 days after the murder, Lazarus reported her off-duty revolver stolen. She said it had been taken from her vehicle. Sherry Rasmussen had been shot with a .38. Lazarus's off-duty weapon was a .38. That report sat in departmental records for 23 years. Nobody connected it to anything because nobody was looking. The stolen gun report deserves more than a passing mention because on its own it is close to remarkable. 13 days after Sherry Rasmussen was shot dead with a .38 caliber revolver, a Los Angeles police officer reported that her personally owned .38 caliber revolver had been stolen from her vehicle. Take the case out of it entirely and consider that as an isolated administrative fact. A firearm of the same caliber as one used in an unsolved local homicide is reported missing within a fortnight by someone in the area. In any competent review that is a data point, departments hold records of officer-owned weapons precisely so that they can be traced. Stolen weapon reports are logged. The two documents existed in the same organization. Nobody joined them, and the reason is straightforward. Joining them requires somebody to be running a query that crosses the two. Homicide detectives working a burglary theory had no reason to search stolen firearm reports filed by their own officers. The stolen gun report went into a record system as a routine administrative matter and stayed there. It is also worth being careful about what the report proves, which is less than it appears. Guns are genuinely stolen from cars. .38 revolver was among the most common handguns in America. The report is powerfully suggestive in combination with everything else and would prove very little standing alone, which is precisely why it needed to be on a desk beside the other documents rather than filed separately. And then the case simply stopped. There is no dramatic moment where it was closed. It was worked, then worked less, then filed. Detectives moved on, retired, died. The physical evidence went into storage, which is where the one thing that saved it was already sitting. At the autopsy, the bite mark on Sherry's forearm had been swabbed. The swab was preserved and frozen. In 1986, that swab was close to useless. DNA profiling existed only in its earliest form and required samples far larger and cleaner than a swab of a bite. Nobody who took it could have said what it would eventually be for. It was taken because taking it was procedure. That is the whole case in the end. Somebody followed a procedure whose purpose had not been invented yet. It is worth being precise about what that swab could and could not do at each stage, because the 23 years are not one uniform period of neglect. The technology changed underneath the case 3 times. In 1986, DNA profiling in criminal work was 2 years old. The technique available was restriction fragment length polymorphism, RFLP, and it was demanding. It needed a relatively large, relatively fresh, relatively clean sample, a bloodstain of reasonable size, not a swab of saliva from skin. It took weeks to run, it was expensive. Very few laboratories could do it, and in a Los Angeles homicide in February 1986, it was simply not on the menu. So the swab was taken as a matter of routine and frozen as a matter of routine, and everyone involved would have understood it as a sample that might one day be useful for blood typing at best. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, PCR arrived, the polymerase chain reaction, which amplifies tiny quantities of DNA into quantities large enough to analyze. That changed the arithmetic completely. A sample that was far too small for RFLP could be multiplied until it was workable. Then through the 1990s came STR analysis, short tandem repeats, which is the basis of modern forensic DNA. It works on degraded and minute samples. It produces a standardized profile that can be compared and databased, and it can be run in days. By the early 2000s, a frozen swab of saliva from a bite mark had gone from useless to entirely testable. That is the arc that made the case solvable, and it is worth noticing that none of it happened because of this case or for this case. It happened in laboratories working on other problems entirely, and the Rasmussen file simply sat in storage while the world changed around it. Which is also why the 18-year gap is not, in itself, the scandal. For most of it, there was genuinely nothing that could be done with the physical evidence. The scandal is the 4 years after the technology caught up. The file sat for 18 years. In 2004, the LAPD's Cold Case Homicide Unit began reviewing old files, as such units do, looking for cases where preserved biological evidence might now be testable with methods that did not exist when it was collected. The Rasmussen case qualified. There was a swab. In early 2005, it was submitted for analysis. The result came back, and it should have ended the case that week. The DNA on the swab came from a woman. Sit with that for a moment. The entire investigative theory, the one that had governed the case for 19 years and had caused a named suspect to be dismissed, depended on 2 male burglars. The saliva in the bite on the victim's arm was female. That single result did not merely add information, it destroyed the premise. There were no burglars. Whoever had bitten Sherry Rasmussen during the struggle that killed her was a woman, and the only woman anybody had ever named in connection with the case had been named in 1986 by her parents. And still nothing happened for 4 more years. It is worth setting that delay against the national picture, because it is not unique to Los Angeles, and it is not really about this case. Cold case units across the United States operate with backlogs that dwarf their capacity. A large metropolitan department may hold thousands of unsolved homicides going back decades, each with a file, and in a minority of cases, preserved evidence. The unit assigned to them is typically a handful of detectives. That arithmetic determines everything. A unit with 4 detectives and 3,000 files is not choosing which cases to solve. It is choosing which cases to look at, and the criteria are necessarily crude, usually whether there is testable evidence and whether a match comes back from a database. And that last point is the one that trapped this case. The 2005 result produced a profile with nothing to compare it to. It was run against the offender database and there was no hit, because the person it belonged to had never been arrested for anything. She was a police officer. In the workflow of a cold case unit, a profile with no database hit is a dead end. It goes back in the file and the unit moves to the next case, because there is nothing further to do with it in the absence of a suspect to test against. What was needed was for somebody to read the paper file and notice that a suspect had been supplied in 1986. That is not a step the workflow contains. It is slow, it does not scale, and it depends entirely on a detective deciding to spend a day on a case that the system has already marked as exhausted. So the 4 years are not, in the main, a story about indifference to this particular murder. They are a story about a process designed around database matching encountering a case whose answer was in a document. This is the part of the story that is hardest to explain and that nobody involved has ever explained satisfactorily. The 2005 result was filed, the case remained open and unworked. There is no indication that anyone took the female DNA finding and went back to the original file to see whether a female suspect had ever been proposed. The most likely explanation is the least satisfying one. The cold case unit was small, the backlog was enormous, and a result with no comparison sample to match against is a result that leads nowhere on its own. A DNA profile is only useful if you have something to compare it to, and in 2005, nobody was going to obtain a comparison sample from a serving lap detective on the basis of a 19-year-old file note. So it waited until somebody read the file properly. In 2009, 2 detectives from the cold case unit, Jim Nuttall and Pete Barber, took the Rasmussen case off the shelf and did the thing that had not been done. They read it from the beginning. And there in the original documents was the Rasmussen statement, a named woman, a police officer, a confrontation at the victim's workplace weeks before the murder. an ex-girlfriend of the husband, set beside a 2005 laboratory result establishing that the killer was female. Once those 2 pages are on the same desk, the case is effectively over. What remained was to obtain a comparison sample, and that was the genuinely difficult part, because the suspect was a serving detective in the same building, and any formal approach would have alerted her immediately. It is worth dwelling on the position those 2 detectives were in, because it was genuinely difficult, and it is easy to underrate from outside. They had a DNA profile from a bite, they had a file note naming a woman, they had a stolen gun report. What they did not have was any way to test the hypothesis without the subject finding out. Consider what a conventional approach would have involved. Requesting a comparison sample from a serving detective requires a warrant. A warrant requires an affidavit. An affidavit naming a lapped detective as a murder suspect passes through the department and the district attorney's office, and the subject works in that building and has done for a quarter of a century, with the professional relationships that implies. The moment that document exists, the risk of the subject learning about it is real, and a suspect who knows she is under investigation can do a great many things, including destroying evidence, arranging an account, or simply refusing to provide anything and forcing the investigation into the open before it is ready. There is also the possibility they had to take seriously that they were wrong. A 23-year-old file note from a grieving family is not proof. If they escalated formally and the DNA did not match, they would have accused a colleague of murder on the basis of hearsay, and both their careers would have been finished. So the surreptitious route was not a piece of cleverness. It was the only method available that could answer the question without either alerting the subject or destroying 2 careers on a hypothesis. And it is legally settled, which is worth stating because people often assume otherwise. Material a person abandons in a public place carries no reasonable expectation of privacy. A cup left on a food court table is not the subject's property anymore. Courts have consistently held that recovering DNA from discarded items requires no warrant. So they did it the way it is done. They followed her, waited until she discarded something she had drunk from at a shopping center food court, and recovered it. The profile from the cup matched the profile from the bite. It is worth being clear about what that match meant statistically, because a match is a phrase that does a lot of concealed work. Modern STR profiling does not report similarity. It reports a set of measurements at a defined number of genetic locations and a random match probability, the likelihood that a person selected at random from the population would produce the same profile. For a full profile from a good sample, those figures run into the many billions to 1. That is the difference between this and the bite mark analysis that convicted innocent men elsewhere. A dental expert asserting a match was offering an opinion with no error rate and no population data behind it. A DNA analyst reporting a match is offering a calculated probability derived from measured allele frequencies across sampled populations. The technique that solved this case is not merely more modern than bite mark comparison. It is a different kind of claim, one that can state how likely it is to be wrong. Before the interview, it is worth noting how unusual this case is in one specific respect, because it explains why it is taught rather than merely reported. Cases where the suspect is a serving police officer are rare, and cases where the suspect is a serving officer of the investigating department are rarer still. The structural problem they create is not that colleagues cover for each other, sometimes they do, but that is the exception. It is that the ordinary machinery of an investigation runs on informal channels, and those channels stop working when the subject is inside them. A detective normally checks a hunch by asking around. He mentions a name to a colleague, looks at a file, runs a query, asks the desk sergeant whether anyone remembers something. All of that is cheap and low stakes, and it is how most leads are triaged out or in. None of it is available when the name belongs to somebody in the building. Every query is a signal. Asking a colleague whether he remembers a detective's whereabouts in 1986 tells that colleague what you are doing, and there is no reason to assume the information stops there. So a lead that would ordinarily cost an afternoon to check instead costs a formal escalation, and formal escalations require a level of confidence that a file note from a victim's parents does not supply. That is the mechanism by which this went unexamined for 23 years, and it is worth being clear that it is a structural problem rather than a moral one. Nobody had to be corrupt. The cheap way of checking simply did not exist, and nobody was willing to pay the expensive way on the evidence available. What happened next is one of the few pieces of this story that exists on video, and it is genuinely strange to watch. On the 5th of June 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was asked to come to an interview room in Parker Center, the Lapt headquarters, ostensibly regarding an art theft matter. She arrived as a detective armed on duty. The interview that followed was conducted by two of her colleagues. It begins gently and circles. They ask whether the name John Rutan means anything to her. She acknowledges knowing him, describes the relationship as casual and appears relaxed. Then they ask whether she remembers his wife. The recording shows the moment the conversation changes character. Her answers become shorter and more careful. She begins to ask what this is about. And at a certain point she says more than once that she would like to leave. The interview is worth examining a little more closely because it is a masterclass in a technique that is easy to describe and hard to execute. The two detectives conducting it did not confront her. They did not produce the DNA result or the file or the name of the victim in the opening minutes. They let her talk about a relationship she believed nobody was examining, and they let her characterize it herself on the record before she knew what the conversation was. That is the entire point of the approach. A suspect who does not know what evidence exists will construct an account calibrated to what she thinks is known. Once that account is fixed on tape, every subsequent piece of evidence either fits it or contradicts it, and contradictions cannot be retrofitted. She described the relationship with Rutan in terms considerably more casual than the record supported. She was vague about the period. And she gave answers about whether she had ever been to the victim's home that would become extremely difficult to reconcile with saliva in a bite mark on the victim's arm. There is also a detail in the recording that has been much discussed and is worth treating carefully. At several points she asks what this is about, and she uses language suggesting she is a police officer being questioned by colleagues rather than a suspect. Whether that reads as innocence or as someone recalibrating is a judgment, and reasonable people watching the same footage have reached different conclusions. What is not in doubt is the structural fact. She attended voluntarily, believing she was assisting with an art theft matter, and left in custody. She was arrested at the end of it. She had been required to surrender her weapon before entering the room, a routine precaution for that interview room, and one that in this instance mattered. She was charged with murder and pleaded not guilty. She has maintained that position and continues to. It is worth registering how the department handled the moment. An officer of 26 years' service was arrested inside police headquarters by her own colleagues on a charge relating to a killing that had happened while she was on the force. There was no way to do that quietly and no version of it that reflected well on anybody. The trial ran in early 2012. The prosecution case had three pillars: the DNA on the bite, which placed her mouth on the victim's arm during a violent struggle; the 1986 report of her stolen .38 revolver 13 days after a murder committed with a .38; and the relationship, the confrontation at the hospital, and a body of evidence that she had not accepted the marriage. The defense argued contamination and mishandling of a 26-year-old sample, which was the strongest available line and a legitimate one to run. Evidence that has passed through multiple custodians over decades is genuinely vulnerable. They argued the investigation had fixed on her late and worked backwards. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder in March 2012. She was sentenced to 27 years to life. Nels Rasmussen, who had been telling the Los Angeles Police Department the name of his daughter's killer since 1986, was in the courtroom. He was in his 70s. The defense deserves a fuller hearing than it usually gets, because the arguments were not frivolous and a jury had to work through them. The central line was contamination and continuity. The swab had been taken in 1986 and had spent 23 years in storage, moving between facilities, handled by people who were mostly no longer available to testify about how. Defense counsel argued that the chain of custody could not be established to the standard the conclusion required, and that in a period when nobody was treating the sample as important, the opportunity for cross-contamination was substantial. That is a serious argument. It is also the argument that has correctly overturned convictions elsewhere. Evidence that sits in a store for decades is genuinely vulnerable, and the honest position is that older samples deserve more skepticism, not less. The prosecution's answer rested on the specificity of the result. A contamination event that happened to introduce the DNA of the one woman named in the file in 1986 from among the entire population is not a coincidence anybody could reasonably credit. Contamination produces random profiles or the profiles of laboratory staff. It does not produce the ex-girlfriend. The second defense line was that the investigation had fixed on Lazarus late and worked backwards, assembling the stolen gun report and the hospital confrontation into a narrative after the DNA pointed somewhere, rather than following them to it. There is something in that as a description of sequence, and nothing in it as a defense. The 1986 file note existed before anybody knew what the DNA would say. Working backwards from a match to find corroboration is what investigations do. The question is whether the corroboration is real, and the file note was contemporaneous. The third was character, 26 years of service, a detective in the art theft unit, a colleague, a mother. That is a real thing for a jury to weigh, and it is why prosecutors are wary of these cases. Juries find it genuinely hard to convict someone who has spent a career on the other side of the table. They convicted in March 2012, and the sentence was 27 years to life. It is worth noting what did and did not follow institutionally. There was no wide public reckoning inside the lab about how a named suspect went unexamined for 23 years. There were reviews and there was considerable press attention, and the department pointed fairly to the fact that its own cold case unit had ultimately solved it. Both things are true. The institution failed to investigate the lead, and the institution eventually produced the detectives who found it. Nuttall and Barber were lapped. The freezer was lapped. The failure and the correction came from the same organization, 23 years apart. The Rasmussen family pursued civil action and were sharply critical of the department's conduct throughout, and it is difficult to read the record and think they were unreasonable. So what should be taken from this? The first thing is about the nature of the failure, and it is more uncomfortable than corruption would be. Corruption is rare and legible. You can investigate it, prosecute it, build safeguards against it. What happened here was not corruption. It was a theory adopted early, a lead that pointed somewhere institutionally awkward, and a long series of individually defensible decisions not to be the person who escalated it. Every one of those decisions was small. None of them required anybody to act in bad faith. The aggregate was 23 years. The second is about the family, and it is the part that should be uncomfortable for anyone who works in an institution. The Rasmussens were right. They were right in 1986, they were right every year afterwards, and they were told by professionals, kindly, repeatedly, that they were mistaken. There is a particular kind of injury in being correct and disbelieved by people who are not lying to you, and they lived inside it for over 2 decades. They also did not stop. That is the only reason the name was in the file to be found in 2009. Had they accepted the burglary conclusion, as most families reasonably would have, there would have been nothing on that page for Nuttall and Barber to read. There is a pattern worth naming here, because this is not the only case of its kind, and the shape repeats. When the suspect belongs to the institution investigating, the failure mode is almost never a decision to protect them. It is the absence of the cheap checks, the informal query, the quiet look at a file, the conversation with a colleague, which are how most leads get resolved. Remove those and a lead that should cost an afternoon costs a formal accusation. and formal accusations require certainty that early-stage evidence never provides. You can see the same mechanism in cases across different countries and different professions. A doctor whose patient deaths are noticed by nurses and not escalated for years, a priest moved between parishes. An officer whose complaints file grows without consequence. The common element is not conspiracy. It is that the person who would have to raise it faces a large personal cost and an uncertain payoff, and the institution provides no low-cost route to ask the question. What makes the Rasmussen case unusually clean as an illustration is that there is no ambiguity about whether the information existed. It was not a suspicion someone had and suppressed. It was a written statement given voluntarily by two people with no motive to invent it, naming a specific individual and describing a specific motive, sitting in the case file unexamined for 23 years. And the correction, when it came, did not require any new information at all. Two detectives read what was already there. The third is the one this channel keeps arriving at from different directions. The case was solved because somebody in 1986 swabbed a bite mark and put it in a freezer. That person could not have known why. DNA profiling, as we understand, it did not exist in a form that could use what they had collected. They took the sample because the procedure said to take samples, and they preserved it because the procedure said to preserve them, and then they went home. 23 years later, that swab did the entire work of the case. It destroyed the burglary theory, established the killer's sex, and provided the comparison that produced the arrest. Every episode on this channel has one of these: a pod in a truck bed, a letter in a newspaper, a parking ticket, a swab in a freezer. The instrument that eventually solves the case is almost never the one anybody was relying on at the time, and it survives only because somebody followed a procedure they had no particular reason to believe in. There is a fourth thing, and it is about what the case did afterwards. The Rasmussen conviction became one of the standard examples cited in arguments for properly funded cold case review, not because the science was novel, but because it demonstrated something cheaper and less glamorous. The case was not solved by a laboratory breakthrough. The laboratory work had been done in 2005 and had sat unused. It was solved by two detectives being given time to read. That is an unfashionable conclusion. Forensic funding arguments are usually made in terms of technology, better sequencing, larger databases, faster turnaround. Those things matter. But a proportion of unsolved cases are not waiting on a technique. They are waiting on somebody to look at documents that already exist, and that is a staffing question rather than a scientific one. The other thing it changed more slowly was how seriously accounts like Sherry's are taken. In 1986, a woman reporting that her husband's ex-partner had turned up at her workplace had no framework to be heard within. California passed the first anti-stalking statute in the United States in 1990, and every other state followed over the following few years. Police training on pre-incident behavior, the pattern of escalating contact that precedes a substantial proportion of these killings, developed over the same period. None of that helps Sherry Rasmussen. It is worth stating, though, because the specific failure in her case was not that nobody was told. She told her parents and a colleague, and her parents told the police, and the information was correct and complete and available. What was missing was a framework in which an ex-partner came to my work and confronted me, registered as anything other than an unpleasant social episode. And the last point is the narrowest and the most practical. The reason this case took 23 years is not that the evidence was absent. Every element of the solution existed by March 1986, the bite swab, the stolen gun report, and a written statement naming the suspect and her motive. What was missing was somebody willing to put those three documents on the same desk and look at what they said together. That is not a technology problem, and no amount of forensic advance fixes it. It is a problem about who an institution finds it comfortable to suspect. There is a version of this story that ends warmly. The cold case unit prevails, the science delivers, the family gets its answer. All of that is true, and it is not the whole of it. Sherry Rasmussen was 29. She had been married for 3 months and had built a career that most people twice her age never reach. What was taken from her was not only her life, but, for 23 years, the acknowledgement that anybody had taken it deliberately. For most of that period, the official position was that she had been unlucky, that she had walked into a burglary. Her parents knew otherwise from the first week, and said so, and were not believed by people who had no reason to lie to them and every reason to be thorough. The swab in the freezer eventually said what the file had said all along. The difference is that the swab was not a bereaved father, so it was listened to.